I realized we were out of sugar the way I realized most things these days, too late, quietly, and alone. Mark had already gone to bed, his side of the room dark and orderly, the faint glow of his phone finally gone. I stood in the kitchen with a mug cooling in my hands, listening to the building settle, and felt the small irritation bloom into something larger than it deserved. Mark and I had been together long enough to stop noticing what we no longer said. Our conversations had narrowed to schedules and reminders, a shared life reduced to logistics. He wasn't cruel or careless, he was simply elsewhere, and I had learned not to ask where. When I reached for the sugar jar and found it empty, it felt like proof of a pattern, small absences accumulating until they mattered. I considered drinking the tea plain. I considered waking Mark. I considered nothing at all. Then I remembered the new neighbor across the hall, the one I'd nodded to in passing but never spoken with. Borrowing sugar felt harmless, almost old-fashioned, the kind of favor that belonged to a quieter world. I slipped on my shoes and stepped into the hallway. The lights hummed softly, casting everything in the same neutral shade. I knocked once, then again, already rehearsing an apology for the interruption. When the door opened, Lucas stood there with an expression that shifted from surprise to ease, as if we'd been mid-conversation and simply picked it up again. "Hey," he said, "you're from across the hall, right?" I nodded, suddenly aware of how late it was. "Sorry to bother you. I'm Ethan. I ran out of sugar." Lucas smiled, not broadly, not performatively, just enough to soften the space between us. "No problem. Come in. I think I've got some." His apartment looked lived in without being cluttered, the kind of place where objects had been chosen rather than accumulated. He moved with unhurried confidence, already reaching into a cabinet. I noticed how he listened when I spoke, how his attention didn't drift even as he measured sugar into a small container. "Long day?" he asked. "Long stretch," I said, and surprised myself with the honesty. "Feels like that lately." He handed me the sugar. Our fingers didn't touch, but the moment held anyway. "Yeah," he said, "I know that feeling." We stood there longer than necessary, exchanging the kind of details that usually come later, how long we'd lived in the building, what brought us to this part of town. Lucas mentioned moving recently, the relief of starting over somewhere quieter. I told him Mark and I had been here for years, that the walls felt thinner now, though I didn't explain why. There was no flirtation I could point to, nothing overt or reckless. What unsettled me was the ease. With Lucas, words arrived without effort. He asked questions that didn't feel like obligations, and when I answered, he seemed to weigh my responses, as if they mattered. "Well," I said finally, aware of the hour. "Thanks for the sugar." "Anytime," he replied. Seriously. I stepped back into the hallway with the container warm in my palm, the door closing softly behind me. The walk back to my apartment felt shorter than it should have. Inside, the kitchen light flickered on, and everything looked exactly as I'd left it. I stirred sugar into my tea, watching it disappear. The sweetness was immediate, familiar, but my thoughts stayed across the hall. I wondered when it had become rare for someone to look at me the way Lucas had, present, unguarded, as if the moment was enough. In the bedroom, Mark slept facing away from me. I set the mug down and lay beside him, careful not to wake him. The ceiling fan traced slow circles above us, steady and indifferent. I told myself the knock had meant nothing, that borrowing sugar was just borrowing sugar. Still, as sleep refused to come, I kept replaying the sound of Lucas's voice saying my name, the way it had landed without expectation. It lingered, light but persistent, like a taste I couldn't quite forget. I returned the sugar the next evening, though I could have kept it longer without consequence. The container sat on the counter all day, waiting, until it felt less like an errand and more like an intention. Mark was working late again, his messages brief and practical, and the apartment seemed to echo without him. I told myself that was the reason I crossed the hall. Lucas answered the door with the same easy recognition, as if he'd been expecting me without expecting anything from me. "Hey, Ethan," he said, stepping aside before I could explain myself. I handed him the container and thanked him, and that should have been the end of it. Instead, he asked if I wanted coffee. We sat at his small table, mugs warming our hands, the conversation unfolding in an unforced rhythm. Lucas spoke about his move, how starting over had been necessary even if it was lonely. I shared fragments of my life with Mark, choosing my words carefully, aware of what I was omitting. Lucas didn't press, but he noticed pauses, the way my sentences sometimes trailed off. It's strange, he said, after a moment. Being with someone and still feeling like you're carrying things alone. The observation landed with uncomfortable precision. I nodded, staring into my cup. Yeah, it is. After that, the encounters became frequent enough to stop feeling coincidental. We ran into each other in the hallway, on the stairs, by the mailboxes. Sometimes we talked for a few minutes, sometimes longer. Lucas remembered details, my work schedule, the way Mark liked his coffee, the fact that I hated plain tea. It shouldn't have mattered, but it did. At home, the contrast sharpened. Mark listened, but only with half his attention, his mind already moving ahead to the next obligation. When I spoke about my day, he responded with solutions instead of curiosity. I stopped correcting him when he misunderstood me. It felt easier to let things slide than to insist on being heard. With Lucas, I didn't have to insist. He asked, and then he waited. I began to notice the small deceptions creeping in, not lies exactly, but omissions. I didn't mention the coffees or the conversations. When Mark asked how I knew Lucas's name, I said we'd exchanged it in passing. The explanation was true enough to quiet my conscience, but not enough to settle it. One evening, Lucas knocked on my door. Mark was in the shower, the sound of running water filling the apartment. Lucas held up his phone, smiling apologetically. My internet's down. Any chance I could borrow yours for a bit? I hesitated for a second too long, then stepped aside. We sat on opposite ends of the couch, laptops open, the space between us charged by nothing more than awareness. Lucas worked quietly, occasionally glancing up to comment on something I'd said earlier, picking up threads I'd forgotten I'd left hanging. When Mark emerged, towel around his shoulders, he greeted Lucas politely, distractedly. The interaction was brief, forgettable. After Lucas left, Mark didn't ask about him. I wasn't sure if that relieved me or disappointed me. Later that night, I found myself thinking about how easily Lucas fit into the spaces Mark no longer occupied. The thought unsettled me. I told myself it was natural to enjoy new company, that it didn't mean anything more. Yet I started checking the hallway before opening my door, hoping to see Lucas there, pretending surprise when I did. The realization came quietly, without drama. I was looking forward to him. Not in a reckless way, not yet, but with a patience that felt dangerous. I knew his routines now, the times he was usually home, the days he worked late. I noticed when a light across the hall stayed on longer than usual. One evening, after another easy conversation that drifted from laughter into something more subdued, Lucas looked at me with a seriousness that hadn't been there before. You know, he said, you don't talk much about what you want. I opened my mouth to respond, then closed it again. The answer felt too close to the surface, too honest to offer lightly. Lucas didn't push. He simply nodded, as if acknowledging something we both understood but hadn't named. When I returned to my apartment, Mark was already asleep. I lay beside him, the familiar distance between our bodies feeling wider than ever. Across the hall, a door closed softly. I stared into the dark, aware that time itself seemed borrowed now, and that I was spending it in ways I couldn't yet justify, but wasn't ready to stop. The argument with Mark wasn't loud. That was what unsettled me most. It unfolded in low voices and unfinished sentences, the kind that left no clear beginning or end. I told him I felt invisible. He told me he was tired. We both said things that were true and still managed to miss each other entirely. I'm doing my best, Mark said, already turning away, as if effort alone should be enough to close the distance. I watched him retreat into the bedroom, the door clicking shut with careful restraint. The apartment felt smaller after that, the air heavier. I stood in the kitchen, staring at the counter, knowing there was nothing there that could help me. I crossed the hall without deciding to. Lucas opened the door almost immediately, concern registering before he spoke. Hey, you okay? The question broke something open. I nodded anyway and stepped inside, letting the quiet of his apartment absorb me. We sat across from each other, the table between us an unspoken boundary. For a while, neither of us talked. Lucas waited, the patience of it both comforting and unnerving. I don't know how to fix this, I said finally. I don't even know what this is anymore. Lucas listened without interruption. When he spoke, his voice was steady. You don't have to fix everything tonight. The simplicity of the permission made my chest ache. I told him about the argument, about how Mark heard me but didn't seem to feel me. I didn't embellish. I didn't need to. Lucas seemed to understand the shape of the problem without being given every edge. I keep thinking if I say it differently, he'll finally get it, I said. But maybe he already does, and just doesn't know what to do with it. Lucas nodded slowly. That's a lonely place to be. We moved to the couch at some point, not because we planned to, but because the conversation shifted, softened. The room was dim, the city outside reduced to a low, distant hum. I became aware of how close we were sitting, of the careful way Lucas angled his body toward mine without touching. I don't want to be the reason things get worse for you, he said. The honesty in his voice startled me. You're not, I replied too quickly. The denial felt thin even as I offered it. Silence settled again, different this time. Charged. I could feel the weight of everything unsaid pressing in. When I spoke, it was quieter than I intended. Sometimes I wonder when I stopped being enough. Lucas turned to me fully then. You didn't, he said. You're just not being met. The words landed with undeniable force. My throat tightened. I looked at him, really looked at him, and understood that the line I'd been careful not to cross had been closer than I thought. It wasn't the space between our bodies that mattered, it was the space he had filled in my thoughts. I think about you, I admitted. The confession felt like stepping off a ledge. Lucas didn't move away. He didn't move closer either. I think about you too, he said, and there was no triumph in it, only gravity. We sat there, suspended. No touch, no kiss, nothing that could be pointed to as evidence, except the truth now spoken aloud. I knew, with sudden clarity, that this was betrayal. Not in action, but in intention. In choosing to bring my heart somewhere it no longer belonged. I should go, I said, even as part of me resisted the idea. Lucas nodded. Yeah, you should. At the door, we paused. The hallway light spilled in, flattening the moment into something almost ordinary. Lucas met my eyes. Whatever you decide, he said, make it honest. The walk back felt longer than before. Inside my apartment, Mark slept on his side, one arm flung out as if reaching for something he'd lost. I lay beside him, staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying the evening in relentless detail. I hadn't crossed the line the way people warned you about. There had been no sudden collapse of restraint. Just a quiet acknowledgement that the line existed, and that I was standing on the wrong side of it. Sleep came late, and when it did, it brought no relief. Across the hall, a light went out. I turned onto my side, aware that whatever happened next, there was no returning to the simplicity of before. The days that followed moved with a careful slowness, as if everything in the apartment had learned to tread lightly. Mark and I spoke when necessary, our words polite and contained. He watched me more closely now, not with suspicion exactly, but with a quiet attentiveness that arrived too late to feel comforting. I carried the weight of Lucas's honesty everywhere. Make it honest. The words followed me through routine moments, brushing my teeth, answering emails, sitting across from Mark at dinner while the television filled the space between us. I realized how long it had been since we'd eaten without some other sound doing the work for us. One evening, Mark set his fork down and looked at me directly. Are you happy? He asked. The question landed without accusation, which made it harder to evade. I searched his face, hoping for an answer I could borrow. I don't know, I said finally. It felt like the most truthful thing I could offer without breaking something open. Mark nodded, absorbing it. I thought so, he said quietly. I didn't know how to ask. The admission stripped the room of its defenses. I told him about feeling unseen, about how our lives had begun to run parallel instead of together. I didn't mention Lucas by name at first, but his presence hovered in every sentence, the unspoken proof of how far I'd drifted. I should have said something sooner, I added. That part's on me. Mark listened, his expression steady but changed, as if he were recalibrating an image he'd trusted for years. I wish you had, he said. There was no anger in it, only loss. That night, we slept apart for the first time without framing it as temporary. The space between us felt deliberate now, a pause instead of a habit. I lay awake, considering the shape of my life if I kept choosing silence over clarity. The next day, I saw Lucas in the hallway. We stopped a few feet apart, the distance unmistakable. Hey, he said, cautious. Hey, I replied. Can we talk? We sat in his apartment again, but the ease was gone, replaced by a shared seriousness. I told him about the conversation with Mark, about the truth I was finally willing to face. Lucas listened, just as he always had, though I could see the restraint in him now. I don't want to pretend nothing happened, I said. But I can't pretend it didn't matter either. Lucas nodded. I don't want to be a secret, he said. Or a reason you hurt someone. I know, I said. And I did. That was the clarity I'd been avoiding. We agreed to step back, not with promises or dramatic declarations, but with an understanding of what was at stake. As I stood to leave, Lucas offered a small, rueful smile. Funny how something so small can change everything. I returned to my apartment carrying that thought. Mark was packing a bag, his movements efficient, composed. I'm going to stay with a friend for a bit, he said. I think we both need space to decide what we want. I nodded, the ache in my chest sharp but clean. I understand. When the door closed behind him, the apartment felt hollowed out, but honest. I made tea out of habit, reached for the sugar, and paused. The jar was full. I laughed softly at myself, the sound echoing. I sat by the window and let the quiet settle. I didn't know what would happen next, with Mark, with Lucas, with myself. I only knew that a simple knock had forced me to confront truths I'd been avoiding for years. Borrowing sugar had seemed insignificant, a moment easily forgotten. But it had revealed a hunger I could no longer ignore. And as the city lights flickered on outside, I understood that whatever sweetness waited ahead would come at a cost, and that this time, I would have to choose with my eyes open.